there's a lot of critiques of this concept, but California has deemed it viable, which is why this requirement went into place. And not a single handgun has been approved for new handgun model has been approved for sale in California since they did that, correct?
Correct. There are the bolt action repeater firearms from Franklin Armory, the AR pistols that made it onto the roster, but those are exempt from that because they're not a semi-auto. So the requirements are different.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I think another tell with that, the whole debate over microstamping is that nobody produces a gun that can do this anywhere in the world, including countries which don't allow civilian gun ownership and presumably would have a greater desire to try and implement this sort of technology if it were feasible, but nobody does anyway.
Yeah.
So
there's no commercial demand for it. And because of that, there is no commercial supply for it.
Yeah. This is, like you mentioned earlier, it's very similar to the smart gun trend, which is not implicated by this law, but is another area where people debate these sorts of technologies and why they aren't currently available on the market. Because obviously what you'll hear from supporters of the microstamping requirements are effectively that the industry has banded together to not produce these because they don't want people to be able to track fired brass or what have you.
Yeah.
That it's really an industry constraint and not a technical constraint. What do you think about that argument?
I think that if the technology was more available, we would see more companies that are in favor of this legislation producing it. The technology is very expensive to design a specific model solely for the California market. And we are a big part of the firearms market. There's a low percentage of people relative to other states in California that like guns and are interested in firearms, but there's a lot of us. So even that small percentage does have a big buying power. So if the technology was wanted, people would make it. And if it was feasible from a economic standpoint to make it, they would make it. And the technology is not easy to implement in the first place. So I don't see the demand. I think the supply would be very difficult for them to do, and it would be undesirable from pretty much anyone that isn't the lawmakers trying to push this to get it to actually happen.
And as far as the other argument for the roster goes, which is that it's furthering California's interest in keeping unsafe handguns out of public circulation. What do you say to that?
I think that if they actually cared about unsafe handguns being restricted and not being on the market, that argument falls apart when you think about the fact that any handgun on the not unsafe for sale roster is by definition an unsafe handgun, because the Glock Gen 3s don't have loaded chamber indicators per the state definition. They don't have a magazine disconnect. They don't have microstamping. But those are still certainly available to purchase. And the off-roster firearms that are considered unsafe for sale can be purchased by law enforcement. Specifically, I believe the LAPD is now switching over to the FN 509 very recently, a firearm that's very popular in any other state and is, per the state of California's definitions, an unsafe handgun. So they seem to... Their argument that they want to keep unsafe handguns out of people's hands falls apart when you look at what they allow to be sold currently and who they allow to buy these unsafe handguns.
Yeah. I certainly think the police exception kind of undercuts the whole idea. Very similar to this argument about weapons of war that we've all heard repeatedly, because all of the assault weapons bans that have been proposed also have exceptions for law enforcement, which... If these are weapons of war, it's quite odd to...
Who are they at war with?
Yeah, equip them for law enforcement officers. But
and why does the horse racing board of California, why do they need unsafe handguns? They were recently added to the list. There's a ever-growing list of departments that I'm confused as far as what law enforcement activities they're doing in the first place and why they specifically need to access unsafe handguns.